Nobody moved. That is the part nobody talks about. Not the iceberg, not the band playing, not the lifeboats. The part that should haunt every person who has ever heard the name Titanic is the 45 minutes when the ship was already dying, and almost nobody on board believed it. April 14th, 1912. 11:40 at night, the North Atlantic. The temperature of the water was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees below the freezing point of fresh water, kept liquid only by its salt content. A human being thrown into that water without a life jacket had roughly 15 minutes before. The cold shut their body down, less if they panicked, less if they were elderly, less if they were a child. 2,224 people were on board the RMS Titanic that night. 1,517 of them were about to die, and the most unbearable truth of all, the truth that has driven historians and survivors and the families of the dead to fury for over a century, is that almost none of those deaths had to happen. The Titanic did not have to sink the way it sank. The people on board did not have to die the way they died. At nearly every step of the disaster, from the ship's construction to its final plunge into 2.5 miles of black ocean, someone made a choice that made the outcome worse. And almost every single time, they made that choice because they could not bring themselves to believe what was actually happening. This is the story of the night the unsinkable ship sank, and why nobody believed it until it was already far, far too late. To understand the disaster, you have to understand what the Titanic was supposed to represent, not just a ship, an idea. By 1912, the world was in love with the concept of industrial progress, steam engines, electric lights, wireless telegraph. The telegraph alone felt like magic, a message sent from a ship in the middle of the Atlantic, received in New York within minutes. The world was shrinking, technology was winning, and the Titanic was the physical embodiment of that belief. She was owned by the White Star Line, controlled by J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine. She was 882 feet long, nearly 3 football fields laid end to end. She weighed 46,000 tons. She had a swimming pool, a Turkish bath, a squash court, a first-class dining saloon that stretched the full width of the ship and could seat 550 people at once. Her first-class suites were not just comfortable, they were designed to make the wealthiest passengers on Earth forget they were at sea at all. Mahogany paneling, carved fireplaces, private promenades. Some passengers reportedly said you could not feel the ship moving, and there was the reputation. White Star Line had not called the Titanic unsinkable in its official literature. That myth came from a trade journal, but the idea had taken hold. The ship had a double bottom. It had 16 watertight compartments separated by bulkheads. It could stay afloat with any 2 compartments flooded. It could survive any 4. The engineers and the company and the press had created a story so convincing that even the people sailing on the ship believed it completely. That belief was about to kill them. What they did not realize was that the safety features they trusted had limits nobody had clearly communicated to the people who needed to know them. The watertight bulkheads did not extend all the way to the ceiling of each deck. They rose to E-deck in most sections. This meant that if the ship tilted forward, if the bow went down far enough, water would simply spill over the tops of the bulkheads from one compartment into the next, like water overflowing from one ice cube tray into the adjacent one. It would not stop. It could not stop. Once it began, the sequence was irreversible. The iceberg that struck the Titanic that night opened a gash, or more accurately, a series of buckling punctures, along approximately 300 feet of the hull, across 6 of those 16 compartments. 6. The ship could survive 4. The moment the iceberg finished its work, which took roughly 10 seconds of contact at 22 knots, the Titanic's fate was sealed. The physics were already running. The math was already done. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, knew this within the first 20 minutes. He went below with the captain to inspect the damage. He looked at the rate the water was rising. He did his calculations quickly, the way a man does when he does not want to do them but knows he must. He told Captain Edward Smith the truth in quiet, direct language. The ship would sink. She had perhaps an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours at the outside. He was, as it turned out, almost exactly right. But then Captain Smith had to tell the passengers. And this is where the disaster stopped being a story about engineering and became a story about human psychology. At 12:05 in the morning, 25 minutes after the collision, Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered and the passengers mustered. But he did not tell them why. He did not tell them the ship was sinking. He did not tell them they needed to get into the boats immediately. He did not tell them that the water was 28 degrees and that time was the one thing they did not have. The result was chaos disguised as calm. Passengers came up to the boat deck in their life jackets and looked around at a perfectly still, brightly lit ship with no visible list, no dramatic flooding, no obvious emergency, and most of them thought, this cannot be serious. First-class passengers particularly, warm from the dining saloon, well-fed, comfortable, could not reconcile the idea of danger with the physical reality of a ship that felt solid beneath their feet. The lifeboats began loading, and this is where the numbers become unbearable to read. Lifeboat 7 was the first one lowered. It had a capacity of 65 people. It left with 28. Lifeboat 1 had a capacity of 40 people. It left with 12. 12 people in a boat that could hold 40, while 2,200 people stood on the deck above a freezing ocean. The total lifeboat capacity of the Titanic was 1,178 people, already not enough for the full passenger and crew count. A fact that itself deserves its own reckoning. But the boats were not even being filled to that inadequate capacity. They were leaving half empty, quarter empty, because the passengers standing on a ship that still felt solid did not want to climb into a small wooden boat hanging over the black ocean 70 feet below. Some women refused to leave their husbands. Some passengers were simply not found in time. Many third-class passengers on the lower decks had to navigate a labyrinth of corridors and locked gates, and some were still trying to find their way to the boat deck when the ship went under. Some crew members, undertrained and underinformed, simply did not know how many people the boats could safely hold under lowering conditions and loaded conservatively out of caution that killed more people than it saved. What they did not realize, what almost nobody on that ship fully understood, was that every minute of hesitation was a minute that could not be recovered. The water was rising below, it was rising fast, and the ship was beginning, very slowly, to tilt. The band was playing on the deck. This fact has become so associated with romantic tragedy that people sometimes forget how horrifying it actually was in context. The band played not as a noble last gesture, but as part of an attempt by the crew to maintain calm, to prevent panic, to keep the passengers from understanding the full truth of what was happening. They played ragtime, they played waltzes, they played while the lifeboats left half empty and the clock ran down. At 2:05 in the morning, Collapsible D became the last lifeboat successfully launched. By this point, the bow was underwater. The angle of the deck was becoming impossible to ignore. Stewards and officers were now telling passengers directly, "Get into the water, swim for the boats, there is nothing left." But the water was 28 degrees. And by now there were more than 1,500 people left on a ship that had run out of lifeboats. And that is when everything changed. At approximately 2:17 in the morning, the forward funnel collapsed. The lights, which had stayed on until almost the very end, another piece of engineering the crew had fought to maintain, flickered and went out. The ship had been tilting forward for over an hour. Now the angle accelerated. People who had been standing on the deck were suddenly on a surface tilted at 20 degrees, then 30, then steeper still. Everything that was not bolted down began to slide. The screaming that survivors described, a sound unlike anything they had ever heard or ever would hear again, began. The stern rose out of the water. This is the image most people know from films. But what the films cannot fully convey is the noise. The sound of a ship breaking apart is not a cinematic crack. It is the sound of 10,000 tons of metal and wood and glass and machinery tearing itself apart under forces it was never designed to withstand. Witnesses in the lifeboats described it as the sound of the world ending. Some said they heard it for years afterwards in their sleep. The ship broke. The bow section separated from the stern somewhere between the third and fourth funnels and plunged downward at roughly 30 miles per hour. The stern, briefly freed of that weight, righted itself for a moment, then it too went under. At 2:20 in the morning on April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic disappeared from the surface of the ocean. She had been afloat for 160 minutes after hitting the iceberg. Thomas Andrews had estimated between 90 minutes and 2 hours. He had been right within 10 minutes. What was left on the surface of the North Atlantic was 1,500 people in 28-degree water, and 712 people sitting in lifeboats that had room for more. The people in the water did not die quietly. This is the part that haunts the survivors' testimonies more than anything else. They screamed. They called for help. They called specific names. They called for their wives and their children and their husbands. The sound carried across the flat, still water with horrible clarity to every person sitting in every lifeboat within half a mile, and almost none of those lifeboats went back. Officer Harold Lowe in Lifeboat 14 was one of the very few who returned. He waited until the sounds had diminished, until the people in the water had gone quiet from the cold, and then he went back and pulled out 4 survivors. 4 from an ocean full of the dead and dying. He later said he waited because he feared the drowning people would swamp his boat in their desperation. It was a rational calculation. It was a calculation that cost hundreds of lives. The other boats did not return. Some were too far away. Some were too panicked. Some were commanded by people who made the same calculation as Lowe, and then, unlike Lowe, did not go back anyway. The testimonies of the survivors about this, about sitting in a half-empty boat, listening to the sounds from the water, are among the most painful documents in maritime history. Several survivors said they never fully recovered from it, not from the sinking, from the sounds, and from the knowledge that they survived in a boat that could have held more. The RMS Carpathia arrived at 4:10 in the morning. She had been 58 miles away when she received the Titanic's distress signal and had driven through the night at her maximum speed, her own crew scanning the dark water for icebergs, pushing the ship harder than she had ever been pushed. She was the first ship to reach the site. She pulled 712 survivors from the lifeboats. She found no one alive in the water. The inquiry that followed, two of them, one American, one British, produced more than 3,000 pages of testimony and a series of reforms that changed maritime law permanently. Ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for every person on board. Lifeboat drills became mandatory. The International Ice Patrol was established to monitor iceberg conditions in the North Atlantic. The wireless telegraph, which had been operated on the Titanic by a commercial company that saw no urgency in relaying ice warnings to the bridge until it was too late, was brought under stricter regulation. The Californian, a ship that had been stopped for the night just 10 to 20 miles away, whose crew had seen rockets fired from the Titanic and had not responded, was found by the inquiries to have failed catastrophically in its duty, though the exact distance and the full truth of what her crew saw and chose not to do is still argued over by historians. The captain went down with the ship. Thomas Andrews went down with the ship. The band, all 8 musicians, went down within the ship. Isidore Strauss, the co-owner of Macy's department store, refused to get into a lifeboat before the other men and went down with the ship alongside his wife Ida, who refused to leave him. More than 700 of the 710 crew members who died that night were working men, stokers, firemen, engineers, stewards, who stayed at their posts keeping the lights on and the steam up and the pumps running so that the passengers above had the best possible chance. Most of them were never mentioned in the newspaper coverage that consumed the world in the weeks that followed. The Titanic has been studied more than perhaps any other maritime disaster in history. Her wreck was found in 1985, 2.5 miles beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, split into 2 main sections separated by about 1/3 of a mile. Thousands of artifacts, shoes, dishes, letters, a pocket watch stopped at 2:16, children's toys, rest on the ocean floor in what divers call the debris field. They will stay there. The ship herself is slowly dissolving, consumed by iron-eating bacteria. In perhaps another 30 years, what remains of the hull may collapse entirely. The ocean will have finished what the iceberg started, and here is the question that sits at the center of all of it. If the ship's officers had loaded every lifeboat to full capacity, they could have saved over 400 more people. If even 3 or 4 of the lifeboats that stayed away had gone back into the field of swimmers within the first 10 minutes, before the cold had done its worst, historians estimate they could have saved hundreds more. If the Californian had responded to the rockets, if the wireless operators had treated the ice warnings with the urgency they deserved, if the watertight bulkheads had been extended another deck higher, if the ship had been carrying the 64 lifeboats that had originally been considered and then reduced to 20 because someone decided the deck looked cluttered, if just one of those things had been different. 517 people died in the North Atlantic on the night of April 14th to 15th, 1912. Largely because nobody could fully believe that the unbelievable was actually happening. The ship was unsinkable, everyone knew that, and so when it began to sink, the human brain did what human brains do in the face of the impossible. It delayed, it rationalized, it looked for evidence that things were not as bad as they seemed. It searched for reasons to stay comfortable and warm and inside, rather than climb over a railing into a small wooden boat above an ocean so cold it would kill you in minutes. That delay, spread across 2,000 people making thousands of individual choices over the course of 160 minutes, cost over 1,500 lives. The Titanic did not sink because of an iceberg. It sank because of certainty. The certainty that the ship was safe. The certainty that there was time. The certainty that surely someone else was handling it. The certainty that the impossible was not happening. Right up until the moment the ocean swallowed the lights and the music stopped and the only sound left was the water. What if they had believed it sooner? What if the first lifeboat had left full, and then the next, and the next? What if the people in the water had heard the sound of oars coming back toward them in the dark instead of silence? How many of the 1,517 would have seen the morning? We will never know. The ocean kept that answer along with everything else.